Hello, hello. I want to welcome you to Breaking the Silence School Based Strategies for Black Youth Suicide Prevention. This is such a critical topic to be addressing today
Mm.
because of the rising mental health crisis among Black youth. I'm Jennifer Dunn, founder and CEO of Boontiful Learning for Life, where we work to ensure students are college and career ready across K 12 education, higher education, and corporate training sectors. Our work has impacted over thousands of students annually through our innovative programming and culturally responsive tools. As a former director of counseling engagement at the College Board and past president of the Maryland School Counseling Association, I've dedicated my career creating equitable educational opportunities for all. And I am so excited because I get to introduce my colleague as well as fellow former Maryland School Counseling Association president, Dr. Nikki Poindexter Ham. Dr. Ham brings over 15 years of experience as both a licensed clinical professional counselor and licensed school counselor to our conversation today. As an assistant professor of counseling at Bowie State University, and executive director of the UGMA Center for School Counseling Scholars, she has dedicated her career to improving student outcomes through innovative school community partnerships. Dr. Ham's work in mental wellness and culturally responsive counseling has made her a sought after speaker at national and international conferences. Her unique perspective combines academic expertise with practical experience, making her insights particularly valuable for those working directly with Black youth in educational settings. Today, Dr. Ham will share strategies for implementing culturally competent mental health screening, building protective factors, and creating supportive school environments that promote Black student well-being. We need to talk about all well-being for all of us, but today we're going to talk about Black student well-being. She also addresses how schools can better partner with families and communities to create comprehensive support systems. Now, I said a lot and I gave a lot of great introductions to Dr. Ham, but I do want to start today's conversation about this is not necessarily the most appealing or enticing topic. And I would like you to just kind of introduce what drew you to this critical work in Black youth suicide prevention.
I think it's my own personal experience. One, first, thank you so much, Jennifer, for this wonderful introduction. And it was really great to connect with you and to have this conversation. My fellow immediate past president for the Maryland School Counselor Association. And I think we probably share that, our shared history in being school counselors. That's really, I think, what drew me to this work. My own personal experiences with whether it's friends throughout youth, experiencing feelings of suicidation, and working with friends and family members who have experienced that. And then also as a school counselor, seeing firsthand. And I think the reason why I look at, and you said earlier, which is so true, looking at all youth, because that is really important to understand that, but also understanding that usually students come in who are experiencing suicidation with some lived experiences that may impact ideation, that thought of suicide. And so really examining, how does race have an impact on that? How does gender have an impact on that? What does that look like? Which strategies as a school counselor I found worked with some students and didn't work with other students? So I really wanted to, especially as a school counselor, provide support for not only myself, but for the families that I worked with and for the students that I worked with.
You know, the reason why I really wanted to have you on to talk about this topic is because it has hit home with very
Yes.
close friends of mine where young people from as early as elementary
Yes.
school, sometimes in second and third grade, are having these suicidal thoughts and thinking about them. And I really felt like, I'm not in a school right now, but being in a school, how do you really, start to have a conversation? How do you start to create strategies? What do you do to create a safe place where young people can say, I have other um, channels I can address where I feel pressured or I feel challenges where I'm having these different types of thoughts. So,
Absolutely. And when you say that, I mean, the CDC puts out, and we've talked about that, and I'll share that link, which is a youth risk behavior survey. Every 2 years, they put that out, and they send it out to middle school and high school students across the country. And really, if you take a look at it, when we're talking about Black youth suicide, it increased by 37% from 2018 to 2021. And Black children aged 5 to 12 are nearly twice likely to die by suicide as their white peers. So that's what brings that conversation. We sometimes think when we're talking about it, we're talking about high school students, but I've worked with, as a professor, and I've been a school counselor at every level. I tell somebody, I've been somebody who has been at every single level. I've worked with 2-year-olds all the way up to collegiate level and beyond, ongoing learners. And so one of the things, and in my experience as a professor, but also as a school counselor leader, because I worked at the district office, is working with elementary school children who were experiencing and having suicidal thoughts. And sometimes you don't think that children begin to have that. And you're like, what are their problems? But they are. And we can't forget that all children have experienced really significant trauma from, COVID to, that loss of loneliness. We have an epidemic of loneliness going on, and children are experiencing that too. There is challenges with how to socialize that, some of the things that we've learned. I love my technology. I'm always having it, but some of the parts of that is really kind of taken away from students is that social skills. Because if we're spending time on our phones, and I look, I'm a parent too, so I'm not judging at all. But what we're looking at is students are not necessarily having the skill set to make friends, to handle conflict, because they're not necessarily on the playground outside after school, but they might be, on their phone, on a tablet, or they, life is demanding. They may be, in a program or something like that their parents have them involved with. And those things can really create and add to that sense of loneliness, that sense of isolation that some students, I'm not saying all, but some students may feel.
Well, you brought up the recent information about the CDC and the data, and you talked about the pandemic. And at the time, there was a crisis in which the CDC were saying that there's alarming increase of suicide rates among Black youth.
Yep.
And based on the research, that there's unique stressors and risk factors that educators and school counselors be particularly aware of. And I really think it's important to talk about Black students and those particular stressors. And if you could kind of give a little bit more information about that.
Sure. I mean, definitely. You talked about that. Again, that's a youth risk behavior survey. And really, one of the things that you begin to look at is that students, particularly, again, SAMHSA has reported that 90% of Black adolescents report experiencing racial discrimination given within a year that they are doing. And this can then link to severe depressive symptoms in 53% of Black youth, and this rising suicide rate. So that's one of those things, if you think about those unique stressors that you're having, the experience of racial discrimination that you have in the school place, as well as then you think about academic challenges that students are having. And this, again, is all students may be having. We have the loss of learning that has happened. And so there can be sometimes this feeling of, I'm not good enough, I'm not adding up. And that can then have that impact on your academic ability to be successful. The other piece is we have a chronic experience, and we're seeing a growing rate of anxiety and depression. And that's really significant. And it is so, I get caught up in this because this experience of when you're experiencing maybe, ongoing, whether it's loneliness, racial discrimination, academic challenges, and then you add to this feeling of, maybe anxiety or depression, especially particularly within Black youth, these begin to add to this, what I always say in some ways, this recipe for the suicide ideation. And so these are things that can then add to people, and especially we're talking about youth in this case, to then feel as if they don't have any other recourse. And so then you begin to have these suicide ideation, suicide thoughts and ideas of suicide. And then finally, I would probably also say another big piece is that low self-esteem. Again, social media is wonderful in some ways, but it's challenging in other ways because you're always looking at yourself and you're examining, oh, I'm not, as I put my phone up there, but it's this self-reflection and self-examination that you leave yourself beginning to feel as if I don't fit in, I'm not matching, I don't look like. And so those can then also be additional factors that add to that sense of suicidation.
And I was just thinking, many Black youth, even when I was in working as a school counselor, is that they exhibit depression and stressors differently. Sometimes it could be looked at as a behavior problem. It's not necessarily withdrawn behavior where it's a quiet behavior. It might be looked at as an angry or an aggressive behavior from, the educator standpoint where, oh, this child is just angry and aggressive. And so let's just put more, whatever on them to make sure they can behave or they're not talking or, something like that. I think that is really, really important.
Yes. I think, what you hit it right on the head, especially when we look at how depression can show up, anxiety can show up based on gender sometimes. Sometimes disproportionately, it can show up in the people identifying as boys or having that masculine energy as anger. And sometimes it is really maybe reflected outwards to people where you really are maybe anxious, upset, and sad, but it then is projected outwards. Whereas sometimes, and these are broad strokes, so I don't want to say that I'm painting and saying this for all, but just what we have seen in terms of that. So then if it is projected as anger, and maybe I am angry, frustrated, mad, then it can look like insubordination. It can look like, not willing to follow directions. Insubordination, the same thing. It can look like, agitation. It can look like a number of different things, getting into fights. And so then maybe students are not getting the clinical help that they need through a school counselor, a school social worker, a school psychologist, but maybe are getting the punitive component of it, where they maybe are suspended. And I am not saying, because I've worked in schools for, numbers of years. So I am not saying that students should not get consequences, but what I am a very firm advocate for is to have a school-based mental health practitioner that's in those spaces, that is there, not giving out the consequences. That's not what we do, but to be a part of some of those conversations when you have some people who are the frequent flyers, who are acting uncharacteristically. And you're like, oh my goodness, this child has never done this before. Why did they get in a fight? This is so uncharacteristic. Let's sit down and have a meeting and have a conversation with the student, with the family, to find out what is going on. Talk with the teachers, having that counselor there, because that's what we're trained to do, to have that analysis and that conversation to determine maybe there's something going on. And a lot of times you find that students and people who act uncharacteristically, really it's coming from something else, whether it is some social emotional, some sort of, experience or trauma that they may be going through, but it requires a little bit of time to investigate and to navigate that.
And before we move on to the next question, I feel like we stayed on this first question, but you said confidence, and I have to say something about this. I just think about youth comparing themselves, and you talk about social media. And first of all, for Black youth, there's a different standardization of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, as far as body image, as far as acting, as far as, culture, traditions, and things like that. And so when you start, and then also you have, what you call pop culture or trending culture for young people, where they're then immediate gratification. I need to have this purse, or I need to have this outfit. I need to have all of these things as the standard, and this is what you need to have to be
beautiful,
whatever. And so the confidence in comparing.
Yes.
I can't even imagine. I didn't have, I'm dating myself, but I was old. I didn't have all this social media. So the thing is that it can be challenging to combat what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that is something that, and I think we both said it too, which is we don't necessarily even really understand. If we adults could have a real conversation to say that we really don't understand what our young adults are going through because we did not navigate adolescence in this, where your life was the Truman Show, essentially. I mean, if anybody, and again, I'm dating myself, but where your life is its own reality TV show for the most part, where you can be on camera 24/7, and people can have access to you, meaning your classmates, people from all over the world can have access to you and comment on your looks, even on your best day or your not so great day. And who, as adolescents, oh my goodness, I don't want to think about some of the things I wore, how I stopped my hair, all of those things throughout adolescence. But oh my goodness, no. But these students and these young adults and youth, they have that, and in some cases it may not even be by their own willingness to post and share that. I mean, you think about social, it's everywhere. So you're at a dance, you're at a football game, you're at a basketball game, you're at an event, and people may be filming you unbeknownst to you. Maybe you know about it, you're like, really don't want to know, and they're catching you in a moment of awkwardness or whatever, and that then is documented on social media platform and can live forever. I mean, I think we don't really realize how significant an impact this presence of social media has on youth and young adults' self-image, because they're constantly, and people then can comment on your appearance and from all over.
Yes.
I mean, it is, I don't think, I mean, you would think about it. There was a time when maybe people said something about you, but they said it behind your back. Rarely did people say it directly to you. So you didn't even know if people were necessarily saying things in some way that maybe provided a coverage. But this, you see it, and it's out there for everyone to like, to comment on, to share a variety of different things. So it can make, I believe, young adults very nervous and anxious when we're talking about, because remember I said earlier, there is this epidemic that we have. We talk about loneliness, that the previous Surgeon General spoke about, that we have an epidemic of loneliness, and he was talking about older adults. But I do believe in what we're starting to see also is youth and young adults are, and even though they're surrounded by groups of people, they're not having the social skills to build friendships, to make and connect connections with people. They're experiencing, and then by result of that, there is this sense of isolation or feeling alone, or as if you're missing out. You think everybody else is out at a party and you're missing out. But reality is they may be at home, but there's this FOMO, fear of missing out, that's going on. So you have so many different layers that are happening that I think deeply impact students' self-confidence. So you have the imaging that I talked about, you have the commentary that people are always commenting on, and then you also have this thought of everybody else is having fun. I don't have friends. I'm not making connections. There's something wrong with me. When in reality, everybody's probably just not making those same connections. But what we see is that we only see the highlights of people's existence, and we don't see the challenges.
Right. So that brings us to another layer, right? Mm-hmm. So how can schools better support Black students who may be dealing with intersectionality and identities such as LGBTQ community and Black youth, and their suicide prevention and efforts?
Yeah, I think that is one of the things that, despite what people want to say, our students, these youth, are here, and we're not going to act like and erase and pretend that they are not here. We're not going to provide a space. I think as an educator, as someone who cares for children and people, I think that seeing humans for who they are is, I think, a foundational and a human value, and honoring who they are is, I think, significant to every person. And I think it only makes us a better community when we do that. So with that said, it is so important that I think that schools and those who work with youth and young adult are intentional about making sure that they create space for those students that identify as part of the LGBTQIA plus community. And so one of the things that is so important is that really 41% of Black LGBTQIA plus community youth considered suicide in the past year. So when we take a look at the data of just Black youth, we're about 19%. Last year, the year before was about 22%. Now it's about 19. So we see a little bit, 3% in 2023. They do the youth what the data I'm quoting is a youth risk behavior survey, which comes from the CDC. They do that every 2 years. They do this youth risk behavior survey every 2 years. So there will be another one that is going to be given out in 2025. So we'll have that data. So the most recent we have is 2023. And so for our youth, in 2021, the data was about 20% for Black youth. And then it dipped, I said, in 2023, which was good, about 19%. But then what we do see is that when we're talking about 41% of Black, so that is nearly, then when you add in that intersectionality of, within the LGBTQIA plus community, that nearly doubles. Mm. And that is really alarming. And then of that, 14% attempted suicide. So this is really significant because, this only is 39% received out of those 41%. And this is from this data, received professional mental health care. So, I mean, I can't even, it is so important. And when I'm saying only 39%, I'm going to say only 39% of Black youth receive professional mental health care compared to 47% of the LGBTQI, just youth overall. So we're seeing what we're seeing again. And let me be very clear. We're seeing that within the Black community, within LGBTQIA plus community, 41% consider suicide. That's double than what the rate is that was for just Black youth that considered suicide. Because remember, that was about 19.3%. And then what we're having this conversation is, and then those who did, only 39% received mental health care. And so that is why school-based mental health practitioners, school counselors, school psychologists, school social workers are so essential. Because you need to be able to be there to acknowledge who they are, to honor their presence, to honor that they need support, and to be that first line of care to be able to provide that support. You look like you were going to say something. I can go on and on talking about this.
I was just going to talk about, what type of activities or what type of interventions can happen at the school level for, these, intersectionalities, these different identities to address some of these challenges?
I think it starts really simple. First thing is just be a good neighbor. Like, think about Mr. Rogers, like be a helper that he talked about. That it really is that basic. So that's the very first thing that you can do, is to be an adult who cares about another human being, especially a young growing adult in the building. So that is really basic. No, is to be that trusted adult for that person in the building, for that young adult who is the youth that is really maybe struggling, because you never know. You never know if you are that person and the only person that they may have. So that's the first thing. But I think in general, what schools can do is really providing that training for staff and for students, but specifically for staff. So you have a training company is really investing in that. And so that is why when we see the conversations about, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're not talking about training people about Black people. We're talking about really training people about best ways to work with and support other humans that look a little different than you, that may learn differently than you, that may be differently able, that may be however, and all. And so all of us, this country is diverse. And so we want to be able to, at least I know I want people who are intentional about, as they work with me, are intentional with trying to have a little bit of understanding about my lived experience. And I want to work with others where I have a little bit of maybe training or workshop in their lived experience. Because there's some people I've come across, I'm like, oh, I don't know very much about, Polish Americans. So it would be very beneficial for me to take maybe a diversity class to learn about their lived experiences. What is significant? What is important? What are appropriate ways to, would be helpful in terms of providing resources and support? It's just I don't know. It's just being like Mr. Rogers, being kind to your neighbor. So, I mean, that is one of those, very basic to me, is it's like, what you would say to your kindergartners, be nice to your neighbor. And so that is it, which is that training in culturally responsive practices. The other part is, if you can in your school, again, this sounds controversial, it shouldn't be really, is implementing this gay-straight alliances for safe spaces. I don't know if you remember the Minnesota governor who was running with previous VP Kamala Harris. Oh gosh, did his name just go from my brain right off the top right now? But her candidate, her VP candidate.
Oh, yes. Now, yes, I have his face and his son and his family, daughter. Yes.
His name is important, but he's a Minnesota governor. But one of the things that I thought was really profound, and I remember hearing about him, was that he was a football coach. And one of the things he started, which was he was the faculty advisor for the Gay Straight Alliance at his school. I'm like, how significant is that message that you have the football coach of Minnesota, a Minnesota football coach? I'm just making assumptions about Minnesota. That might be some diversity trait I need, where, I'm thinking very, very kind of middle America, what is literally middle America, cold weather, football, and all of the things. But yet he saw it important that he was there for students. And I believe he did that because I believe one of his students was getting bullied or bothered. And he thought it was important for him to step in and serve as the faculty advisor. Those are ways that I think we send really strong messages to our communities and to our students to let them know that we are here. So I think that's a really simple but easy way to provide that support. And again, this piece of it is really making connections, because the reality is the numbers don't lie. And what we're seeing is that disproportionately, students who identify in the LGBTQIA plus community disproportionately are having experience of suicidal thoughts. So I think that is one of the other things. And then building community. And what I mean by that is I'm always somebody that looks to bring in family and friends into the space and all. So opening our doors to invite and say, how can we create a more inclusive environment in this space? And so that is I think another part. And then my last thing, and then I'll stop, is looking at curriculum that is inclusive, that incorporates these discussions to create a space for all people to feel welcomed and seen and valued.
Yes. Tim Walz.
Thank you.
I can't remember. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. So I'm going to skip around a little bit because I want to get to some pieces about documents mentioned about as far as universal screening for mental health. And I think that's the conversation that we need to have. What considerations should schools keep in mind when implementing screening programs for Black students, particularly regarding cultural sensitivity and avoiding potential biases? Because these screenings are happening within schools. And I know sometimes school counselors, they're not necessarily the main mental health professional because they have so many things to do, but they may be the first line of contact, and then they may refer out. But tell me a little about this documentation of these different screenings.
So one of them is the Columbia Rating Scale, which is well, let me first say, because I'm making an assumption that everybody knows when we're talking about a screener. You're like, oh, screeners are really a tool or an instrument that is typically used, and it should be used by a trained professional, mental health professional that does, I always feel like it should be used by a trained mental health professional. Some maybe not always use it that way, but they do just that. They look to provide an initial screening of students who may be experiencing suicidal thoughts, suicidation, maybe depressive thoughts, and who then would benefit from additional services, whether it's with a counselor, whether it's with, a number of different, well, particularly with the counselor. In an ideal world, typically the screener is done by the school-based mental health team that they have, and then is followed up with anyone that needs following up. It's immediately followed up with a referral system. I always say a best practice, really, if you're running screeners in your school, best practices, and I would say the National Association of School Psychologists, the American School Counseling Association has guidance with what are some best practices for doing this. But one of the things is it should not be something that you just pop up and do one day. It should really be organized in a very structured way, meaning that you have your school-based mental health team leading the efforts. You have in place already resources, community resources for counseling, for emergency support in case you need to make an emergency transfer or emergency, they might need emergency mental health support. So you need to think about, okay, what sort of immediate emergency support do we have with midterm kind of, whether it's, counseling resources that we have, and what long-term supports are we going to put in place? Because if our screeners are coming up where we have alarming numbers of students that are experiencing anxiety, depression, okay, we need to really do something then as a department, as a school-based mental health department, to address this need. So I think it's always important. I would say if you're planning to implement, a school system is planning to do that, that they have a strategic plan in place to, one, when they administer the screeners, two, how do you then manage the aftermath of that screeners? I won't say aftermath, but afterwards, what happens afterwards. And then the other component of it is really the education piece of it, because, some parents are going to, in most schools, I believe that, you may have to have parent permission. It depends on your school board and their policy. Most places would probably say that way. So parents that are out there, I would say typically a screener should not be done. That's not really best practice to do that without your knowledge that this is being done. And so again, that is part of that strategic planning. So you're informing and educating people what the screener is and what is not diagnosing your child. Nobody's giving your child a diagnosis. As a matter of fact, in most school districts, I would say, I don't know of any that does diagnosis of children. That is for your healthcare professionals to do that. And so that piece of it, so it's not going to be a diagnosis or anything like that that stays with your child for, some people kind of worry about tracking or anything like that. That is not what it's used for. It really is to identify students who may need, additional mental health services. So it can be very, very beneficial, but it also, I believe very strongly that it must be done in a very strategic and organized format. And I strongly believe that that the school-based mental health team needs to be leading that path.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to say, I know that, we have listeners from all over. And so it's very important to find out what your local protocols are and requirements, and that we're providing, suggestions and support generally, nationally, what could be done. But I'm sure that there might be some protocols that you may need to adhere to. And it's very important that you are knowledgeable, as whether you are a teacher, a counselor, a social worker, a principal in a school, that you understand what these protocols are and requirements.
Yes, thank you for that. And that's why it was very important I gave the general, because you have to be able to know in terms of what your school-based, your school district or your school system, what policy they have. But it can be helpful. But again, I really do caution schools and practitioners for making sure, if nothing else, you should have a strategic plan to implement that rating scale. It should not be something that you just you say, I'm going to do this next week. No. I think that a really strong best practice, and that's why I encourage you to definitely go to National Association of School Psychologists, American Schools Counseling Association. They have a lot of wonderful articles and guidance around that, as well as research. I'm sorry, go ahead.
And I love the fact that, suicide is something that is, what can we do to prevent it? And I think if you have a team and thinking about wellness and well-being, that this conversation is a plan. It's not just a one-stop thing, because we just happened at our school and now we're reacting to it. But what are we doing to make our students feel safe? What are we doing to make them feel connected and belonging? And then giving them an opportunity of who do we go to, and identify the people in the school or outside the school that can support them through whatever it is. We don't have to get to this part of, where we're even talking about suicide or dealing with suicide and supporting students.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I agree. Yeah.
So one of the other things I wanted to talk about, you talked about families and parents and community, and many times school counselors have to collaborate with a lot of people in the school. And so I would like to know what resources or counselors know what to do for Black students experiencing mental health challenges.
Okay. And my thing just went out just for a second, but I think you wanted to know what, like, in terms of collaborating, what would be some resources you would recommend for school counselors to provide?
Yeah, so I was exactly. So it's about school counselors collaborating with
Yes.
families and community, and what type of resources they can garner from the ecosystem or the
Yes.
community.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, not one, I think there's a number of different things, but one of the biggest part is school counselors are, I believe, really a great space, or a great school counselors are key and great at collaborating with their school, their community. So I strongly encourage school counselors to pull into working with their families, and they're part of that community. So really making that connection, whether it's your PTA, which is your Parent Teacher Association, PTO, Parent Teacher Organization, whatever that looks like, become a member of that, become a part of that, because that, I always say, to me, is the first step in building that collaboration. And if your school does not have that, that's fine. That's okay. Find that parent that is there. There's a parent that's always there. And really building that connection with that family member or that person that's there, and finding out who are those kind of people that have that community within the school. The other part that I always say is look around your school and see what businesses that are there. There are small businesses that are there. Really pull into them and connect with them to find out, one, what resources they have, how can they support your school, and two, what can you do to support them and their business, whether it's having them come in for, career day or a variety of different things. The reason why I'm talking about these sort of things is because when we are dealing with mental health challenges, when we're dealing with anxiety, when we're dealing with depression, this isn't just necessarily happening in the school. These things are happening in the community. They're happening in people's families. They're happening in places of business that people in these spaces may see things. And so building and bringing it in, also connecting with your faith-based communities. This is a great space to invite them in, as well as you going in and kind of having, if they have an event or something, to talk about the support that you have, the resources that you have for your community. Some communities, and I don't blame them, are a little bit leery of, educational systems, because educational systems have done harm to Black families, to, we have families right now that are anxious about educational systems because of what, families, immigration status may be, what that might be. And so they're anxious. So, but some of the people may feel more trusted with their faith-based community. So partnering with that faith-based community in terms of whether you're going into that faith-based space and having a conversation about what is school counseling, what do you do, what do you don't do, ways in which you can provide counseling support, or even finding out what that faith-based community has as supports. There is nothing wrong with it. And you have to know your county and what they say in terms of how you share and disseminate faith-based information. Your county might have a closed or an open system in terms of how you can share that. So first, find out what your county or your school district or your school system's policy is. And then once you know that one of the things I would say is then determining how you share and disseminate what resources that faith-based community may have, because they may or may not have. And then the last thing I will say, with school counselors and collaboration is your universities. I teach at a university. Your universities really are, they should be, I'm not going to speak for all, but they should be looking to collaborate and partner with you, especially if they have a college of education. I mean, they're training people to be teachers and educators, and you have a building of people that are teachers and educators. It should work like that. So you really have, I think, a built-in system, and especially if your university or local university has a school counseling program, that is, to me, a win-win-win situation. When I worked in K-12 schools, I always partnered with I'll tell you a little fact. Part of the reason why I'm working at Bowie State is because of my strong partnership with, when I worked at the K-12 level, at the central office level, I was very much, they partnered with us, and we were always doing collaboration and working and a variety of different things. So when an opportunity opened up, Bowie State was like, and I was no longer at the K-12 setting. They were like, hey, what are you doing? Would you like to come here? And I'm like, oh. So, I mean, that is a part of that collaboration that I had with them. So I'm not always saying it doesn't always lead to a job, but I do think it leads to, a better partnership and collaboration in meeting the needs of your students.
So we did have some Comments. Excellent. Not questions yet. So anybody who wants to submit a question through the comments, go ahead. I'll stop my questions and we'll ask Dr. Ham her expertise. But we did have excellent point. We had someone talking about outstanding information. So I do want to ask you a question about, I'm kind of skipping around here. What professional, you talked a little bit, just touched on the training that's necessary in professional development for school staff, and identifying, risk and things like that. What type of training have you seen before, or maybe you have done, and maybe some of the risk factors that maybe need to be talked about in those trainings?
Yes, I think there's different levels of training. And so I'll start with one of the more, I'm in the state of Maryland. I'm a school counselor in the state of Maryland. So in the state of Maryland, there actually is a law that requires all school counselors and actually school-based staff to get trained on suicide risk prevention and intervention. The school counselors have a little bit more of an extensive training that's required. It's called Lorenz Law, and it's named after a young lady who died by suicide, and her mom advocated for training for school counselors and school staff. So that is probably the more the level of where it is required by law for your certification. So every time you go up for certification, or now it's licensed, you have to take the Lorenz Law training, and that's about every 5 years. And so that is typically, it's about, for school counselors, it's about a 2-day training, and school-based staff, it's about, I want to say maybe a 1 day. I can't remember off the top of my head. And so I think that it is really helpful. I can say that for the idea, I will say, to have this conversation about every person to be trained that works with students. As school counselors, most of our training happens, even though we have this Lorenz Law training, most of our training happens in the master's level program. We get a very extensive training. Most school counselors programs about 60 out between 48 credits to 60 hours of credits. That's about between 2 years to 3 years of training that is focused on, mental health needs of youth and adolescents. So we get really targeted training for that. But I think it is so important that we look at providing resources to educators who are working with students. And when we say that, what we're really talking about is suicide identification. Like when we're talking about that, what are the prevention things? Not that you were going in and doing therapy or counseling or anything like that, but you're able to identify when students are maybe having a change in behavior, a change in, how they're interacting, and you're noticing those sort of things. And so workshops and trainings along that line, I think, are very, very important. Again, I'll highlight, we in the state of Maryland have the training that's required for educators, but there are trainings that are out there that are available, and that I think are really culturally responsive and culturally affirming. There is Mental Health Association has what's called first aid mental health training for youth. It's an extensive training, and you can probably find it free. I know that many places, a lot of people have had grants and opportunities to offer the training in their schools. But there, again, I'll say it's the first aid mental health training, and they have a youth component one that is really great. They're not training you to be a counselor. That is not their job. But if you think about it, it's along the lines of, we all know first aid, right? Like Red Cross first aid. So nobody's training you when you do Red Cross first aid. You don't walk away thinking, I'm a doctor. No, you just are stabilizing that person until help can get there.
Yes,
that's essentially the same thing with the first aid mental health training. The goal is to stabilize you until we can get you to a trained mental health practitioner to provide that additional support. So it is really good with helping you to identify when these are their experiences, or people are experiencing maybe mental health challenges, how to help to maybe stabilize somebody without putting yourself in harm. Again, you're not a therapist and you're not a counselor. The goal is just to provide that stabilization, and then how to direct them and get them to somebody that can help. So I think it's important for, just like we had for coaches and a variety of different people have to take, first aid training. I think it's really important that we think about having, especially as we have this growing really challenge of youth mental health, youth that are experiencing challenges with mental health, that we begin to explore this concept of adults really having that first aid mental health training.
I do want to, since it's a good time to bring up, you all are Bowie State
Yes.
in collaboration with the Maryland School Counseling Association here in the Maryland area will be doing some workshops around suicide prevention.
Yes.
And we're going to actually have you talk a little bit about that as we close out and show show the information of what types of things that you will be able to have. But I think that is significant. Why? That's about collaboration with the community. How can, institutions like, higher ed institutions or hospitals or clinics or other mental health, provide training also for parents and families and things like that to bring them into the school to have, conversations about this.
Yeah. Yes. Okay.
So go ahead, Nikki.
No. I was just saying, yes, I agree.
So the other question I wanted to talk specifically about the question about not only professional development, but now talking about policies. Mm-hmm. Gosh, we're dealing with policies even now that are coming down the pipe with new administration and things like that. And so, but before, actually, we had a question that came in. Let me not answer my question because your question is important. What are the identifiers for, families that are stuck in the trauma cycle that may lead to depression and suicide?
That's a good, and I think you need families. So the identifiers, that for families that are stuck in the trauma cycle that may lead to, I think that one of the things that you're talking about sometimes as families, and I'll be very succinct and brief because I'm aware of the time, but we can have a history in our families of trauma and experience of trauma, that goes from one generation to another generation to another generation. Mm-hmm. Really sometimes self-sabotaging, when you have, not being excited or the own sabotaging of opportunities of success. So those identifiers can look like not really being joyous or being able to be grateful, be not grateful. That's a wrong word. Be, realize or be able to live in that moment when good things are happening. Really, some of the other identifiers can be when we're talking about this trauma of is really always expecting the worst. We're always anticipating that the worst is going to happen because we have this history, this trauma in our family of always having, terrible experiences. Really, sometimes having the challenges with making good choices and decisions, whether it's financially, whether it's social, emotionally, picking people as friends, as partners, a variety of different things. So those can then be some of the initial identifiers that people can, I won't say the word stuck in, but it's so much because it's a part of who we begin to be used to. So I don't want to even say stuck because I don't want to be able to blame or make other people feel bad. You just do what you're used to doing. And you're used to that feeling of always feeling like, well, it's always going to be bad. So you just stay in this cycle of that. And so even sometimes it's hard to break out of that because breaking out of that can feel unfamiliar and uncomfortable. When you then are focusing on the positive and great things and wonderful things and making good choices about maybe your partners and jobs, and it just can feel really unfamiliar because all that you have known for a long period of time is this trauma cycle that, like you said, leads to depression and psych. So the best suggestion I have, and then is counseling. I really strongly do that because you're going to need someone to work with you to move out of that cycle, to really help you move through that and all, because you're just using and living and doing what you knew and what you know to do.
I think it's so important, counseling, and even taking any stigma away from counseling as far as young people. If they understand what a counselor is and what a counselor does and how the counselor can support, even at a very young age, then they're more likely to seek out those counseling services. So starting a lot of times with our youth, also with understanding what a counselor is, and that sometimes in our community, it can be a stigma. Sometimes not that we go to our faith-based organizations, but we should go to someone who is trained and being able to seek out those services.
Absolutely.
So I want you to talk a little bit about your training. And I also want to put up information because some people, Dr. Ham, may want to contact you via email or myself about training around this topic. But here's our information here. But I do want you to talk about also the Maryland School Counseling Association and the UGMA Center for School Counseling at Bowie and what you all are doing on February 7th.
Yes, on February 7th, we are having a convening on youth mental health, specifically Black youth mental health and suicide prevention. We're really excited. And when we say a convening, we are bringing together school counselors from all throughout Maryland. And you don't have to come from just Maryland, but this is through the Maryland School Counselor. But if you reach out to me, because we're welcoming all to attend. So school counselors, and this is probably one of the unique things, we're connecting with our counseling center or counseling services at the university. So a lot of times the students graduate K-12 and then they go on to college. And as school counselors, we think, oh, they're just going to be lost out there in the woods. No, they're not. At most universities have, almost all universities have a counseling services or counseling center that are staffed with licensed clinical professionals, counselors who are trained to work with youth and young adult as they're transitioning to this next phase. So they're doing wonderful things. I just sometimes think we don't talk about it and we don't have it. So we'll have school counseling services from Morgan State. We're inviting Coppin State, UMES, and Lincoln University. We've decided to invite Pennsylvania. So Lincoln University will be there as well to have their counseling services staff, school counselors that will be there. We'll have 3 different panels. We'll have a policy and advocacy panel to talk about what policies, especially right now, what policies look like when we're talking about youth mental health. We will have a practitioner panel to talk about their experiences, practitioners, best practices. And then we're going to hear from students, not K-12 students, because we want this to be a conversation where people are adult to be informed to talk about it. And so we're always mindful, you don't want to have, it's 16-year-olds. You're like, so we will have the students at Bowie State. So collegiate young adults, young youth that will be talking about their experiences from college to from high school to college, particularly around youth mental health and around suicide prevention and intervention. So it should be a really good day.
I am so excited. I'm excited that we connected.
Yes,
Dr. Ham, on this particular topic, but I'm sure that the UGMA Center is doing so much more, and we're going to have you back to even talk about what you're doing for the Center for School Counseling Scholars, and to learn more about the center at some point, if you don't mind, not taking up all your time, but but I really want to thank you. This was a great conversation. Again, I do want to put Dr. Ham's information on the screen here. If you have additional information about the actual event that's happening on February 7th, or any additional information for resources, I want to thank you for taking out the time to do this. I kind of called you out the blue, hey, do this, and you were all the way in. So thank you so much for actually being our expert panelist.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having, and I enjoy this time, and I enjoy having the conversation. So anytime, I'm happy to sit and talk with you anytime.
It's funny. One person just put in, and I'm not going to mention his name, but talks about legislation and policy. And I think you are going to have a session about policy at the actual. So if you're in the Maryland area, please make sure that you attend the conference, because they will be talking about policy there.
Yes, absolutely. We'll definitely be talking about policy. And then I also saw the person earlier, which is great. Someone said they have a free, the youth mental health first aid at no cost. So please, definitely, thank you for putting that up there. Reach out, because there's a lot of people, they have wonderful connections. When I say the Mental Health Association has wonderful grants and opportunities. So there's a lot of free trainings out there for youth mental health first aid. It is a phenomenal training and a wonderful experience for people. You don't have to be a counselor at all to do this. So it's a great training.
All right. I want to thank everybody for coming, and we're actually going to sign off. Thank you, Dr. Ham. You have a wonderful rest of the week.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.